Noam Chomsky, on the global economic crisis, healthcare, the media, U.S. foreign policy, the expanding wars in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and resistance to American empire. Noam Chomsky is a world-renowned linguist, philosopher, social critic, and Institute Professor Emeritus at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Among his many books over the past few decades are Hegemony or Survival, America's Quest for Global Dominance, Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of the Mass Media, Profit Over People, Neoliberalism and Global Order, and Human Rights and American Foreign Policy. There's a great collection of his work just out now, edited by Anthony Arnov, called The Essential Chomsky. I spoke to Noam Chomsky earlier this month when we were on the road in Boston. This is part 2 of our conversation. I began by asking him to talk about the current economic meltdown.
Well, let's start with G20. If you look at the Financial Times, the world's major business journal, the day before the G20 meeting, they had a section on it, and they pointed out, I think correctly, that the main purpose is to present a picture of harmony and agreement. It doesn't matter what you do, but make it look as if we're all together on this. Now, there are sharp splits about how to approach the issue, but you have to make it look as if we're all together. That's pretty much what happened. Now, in the communique, which you read before, the crucial word was voluntary. So the countries there are supposed to voluntarily choose to do X, Y, and Z. Well, that means we couldn't make an agreement. So we'll call it voluntary agreement. Now, there was one point on which they agreed, a sharp recapitalization of the International Monetary Fund, poured a lot of money into the IMF. That's a pretty dubious move. I mean, the record of the IMF is more or less a branch of the U.S. Treasury, even though it has a European director. Its past role has been extremely destructive. In fact, its American U.S. executive director captured its role when she described it as the credit community's enforcer, meaning if a third world dictator incurs a huge debt, people didn't, but the dictator did, say Suharto in Indonesia, and then the debt defaults. The lenders, who've made plenty of money because it was a risky loan, so they get high interest and so on, they have to be protected. Meaning not by the dictator, by the people of Indonesia, who are subjected to harsh structural adjustment programs so that they can pay back the debt which they didn't incur, so that we can be compensated. Rich Westerners can be compensated. So that's the IMF, credit community's enforcer, a very destructive role in the third world. Now it's to be recapitalized. Now, there's discussion about this, and it's interesting. You can read it in the financial pages. The supporters of the recapitalization say, well, the IMF has changed its spots. It's going to be different from now on. We realized that it had this terrible role, but now it's going to be different. Well, I don't know, is there any reason to believe it'll be different? In fact, if you look today, it's quite striking to see the advice that the Western powers are following, the programs that they're following, and compare them to the instructions given to the third world. So say, take Indonesia again. Indonesia had a huge financial crisis about 10 years ago, and the instructions were the standard ones. Here's what you have to do. First, pay off your debts to us. Second, privatize, so that we can then pick up your assets on the cheap. Third, raise interest rates to slow down the economy. And fourth, the population suffer, to pay us back. Those are the regular instructions the IMF is still giving them. Now, what do we do? Exactly the opposite. We forget about the debt, let it explode. We reduce interest rates to zero to stimulate the economy. We pour money into the economy to get even bigger debts. We don't privatize, we nationalize, except we don't call it nationalization. We give it some other name, like bailout or something. It's essentially nationalization without control. So we pour money into the institutions. We lecture to the third world that they must accept free trade, but we accept protectionism. Now, take the too big to fail principle, which the House Committee is discussing today. But what does too big to fail mean? Too big to fail is an insurance policy. It's a government insurance policy. Government means the public pays. which says you can take huge risks and make plenty of profit, and if anything goes wrong, we'll bail you out. That's too big to fail. Well, that's extreme protectionism. It gives U.S. corporations like Citigroup an enormous advantage over others, like any other kind of protection. But we don't allow the third world to do that. I mean, they got to privatize so that we can pick up their assets. Now, these are happening side by side. Now, here's the instructions for you, the poor people. Here's the policies for us, the rich people. Exactly the opposite. Is there any reason to think the IMF is going to change it?
Do you think President Obama